Hey everyone, welcome to Christians and Culture. Today we're starting a new little series here. We just went through fear and kind of dealt with that for a few weeks. Today we're going to start on something that, if you're an older Christian, that is someone who's been a Christian for a long time, you might not struggle with as much, but is a very big problem for young Christians. And that is the issue of tolerance. We live in a society that has long preached tolerance, and I should, right here from the start, say tolerance itself is a Christian virtue. There's nothing wrong with tolerance. We are actually told to tolerate the world for the benefit of the world. We should, because FYI, God tolerated you when you were not a Christian, when you were not saved, when you did not bow before the cross. God tolerated you in your sin until you came to a realization of what He was doing and who He was. And so tolerance itself is not a bad thing. The problem is the way tolerance is, I guess, quote unquote, preached in the world today by the world is not really tolerance. Tolerance has become synonymous with acceptance. And especially among younger Christians, the idea has quickly become that if I am to tolerate somebody, I must also accept whatever it is that is wrong. That is, whatever the flaw is, whatever the sin is, I have to accept that. Now, there is sometimes a fine line between this. It's not always easy to know where you should speak out and where you need to be quiet. When Jesus goes in the Gospels, Jesus goes and meets the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. He doesn't go up to the woman and start telling her, hey, your sin is wrong. You need to stop doing this. You need to get over that. You need to not see that man anymore. He doesn't need to say all those things. She already knows what she did was wrong. She was already aware of that. So instead, he just says, forgiven, go and sin no more. And sometimes as Christians, that is the tact we're supposed to take. But other times, evil has to be spoken against. There were times when both Jesus and the apostles, both the apostles in the Gospels and afterwards when they were writing the epistles, had to speak out against various things going on in the world. And so there's sometimes a fine balance, and the question becomes, where do we draw that line? Where do we pick and choose? How do we know when I should be quiet? How do I know when I should speak up? And then more than that, we have this issue among younger Christians. What does it mean to be tolerant? Because they know it is a good thing to overlook flaws and to overlook sins while someone is struggling and trying to become better. But at the same time, they also know there's kind of this contrast, this tension, if you will, where they know they're supposed to do right, that Christ died for them, that calls us to higher standards, that calls us to higher living. They see things like, abortion rampant throughout our culture, and they think to themselves, how do I solve this tension? How do I ease the line between speaking out but also at the same time not turning someone away from God by berating them and essentially calling them the most evil person in the world? I mean, how different would the story have been if Jesus had gone to that adulterous woman and just berated her the whole time? Would she have gone away feeling rejuvenated and eager to serve God? Probably not. She probably would have gone away feeling awful, like she was unworthy to be in God's presence and she wanted nothing more to do with it. So we have to find that line. And so in the next few weeks, we'll kind of go over what it means to be tolerant. Today, we're going to just kind of introduce the topic here. But for the upcoming weeks, I want to set a couple ground rules to help make it easier for Christians to understand what it is we are supposed to do. Strangely enough, Scripture doesn't give us a whole lot of guidance of how we're supposed to interact with the world. It really doesn't. In fact, Scripture almost seems entirely unconcerned with us fixing the world's problems. And I know that's hard for Christians, especially here in America, to understand. We have so much power in America to influence our culture, to influence our politics, that we almost feel like we have this duty. We have to go out there and change things. And sometimes that turns us into what you might call moral monsters, where we get so focused on sin that we forget that Christ died for those people. Christ died so that those people who are currently doing wrong would come to know Him. We get blinded by our zeal, if you will, kind of like Paul before he was Paul, when he was Saul. Paul in his zeal, he thought he was doing the right thing by hunting down Christians and even seeing their execution. He thought he was doing right by God, but really he was blinded by this zeal. He didn't see that really at the heart of all of it was a forgiveness that had come to earth. And sometimes we can miss that too, in our desire to correct wrong thinking and our desire to push back against all the evils that we see in the world. But at the same time, we have a younger generation coming up who's been taught, don't speak out. Don't talk about those things. You need to tolerate everybody. And tolerance has become synonymous with accepting their sin. And there is a difference. There is a difference between tolerating and accepting. So I want to point out here at the very beginning, before we go into these weeks coming up, kind of the ground rules, if you will. The ground rules are this. Scripture is more concerned with you than them. That means that not that you should never speak out against evil, not that you should never stand up for what's right. Instead, what it means is you're not God, and those people out there are not responsible to you. They are responsible to Him. In the same way, you and I are responsible to Him. Our goal should always be to be the lights that God has called us to be in the world. To be the example of what true love looks like. To be the example of what forgiveness looks like. Not to go out and be the sword. You know, sometimes we like to go out and just cut right at people. You know, we see someone in sin and we want to go right at them. Sometimes we're not called to be the sword. We're called to be the healing balm. We're called to be the person who, like Jesus, goes to the downtrodden, the person who knows they're struggling, who knows they're wrong, and not push them down further, but instead pull them up. Pull them up to a God who loves them, a God who has forgiven them. But on the same token, that does not mean we are called to just accept whatever it is anyone's doing. And there are spheres to this. You know, we live in a weird place in America, where a place that's really very different than any other time in history. You know, back in the days of the Bible, if you were a Christian in Rome, you didn't get to choose what laws were passed. You didn't have any influence on whether or not this was accepted or that was accepted. You had to just deal with it. And so that's what the era of the Bible was written in. We have a different kind of power today as Christians, and that becomes a question. How do we use it? And I do think there are times we need to step up and talk against things that are so egregiously wrong against other people, for instance, like abortion. Those are things we need to make sure we're taking stands against. We cannot come to a place where we accept evil, where we say your evil's fine. You don't need to feel bad about it. Because as soon as we do that, why on earth would anyone come to God? Why would I come to God if I don't think there's anything wrong with me? Why would I come to God if I don't think I'm in sin? We have to still be pointing out that evil exists and taking our stand against it. But we also need to make that distinction between evil and the sinner. The sinner, just like us when we were lost in the world, is lost and in need of light. I have two verses here that I want to end with that will hopefully kind of help put things into perspective. Romans 12, starting in verse 2, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Here Paul is telling the Romans, don't be like the world, be different. You have to be transformed. You have to be something that when the world looks at you, they say that is something else. But at the same time, he also says this in 1 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 9. "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." Seems reasonable, right? But verse 10, "Not at all meaning the sexually immoral of the world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such one." You notice here the cutting edge of the sword is not directed at the people out there who are in the wrong. It's directed at the people inside the church who are wrong. The people out there, they're not Christians. We shouldn't be judging them by Christian standards. Yes, we need to speak up for what's right. But we also have to recognize that Those people out there are lost and in need of salvation. And our calling is not to be the judgment sword. Our calling is to be the light that guides them to a better place, that guides them to the cross. So we'll talk a little bit about what it looks like and what it means to be tolerant in this modern age in the coming weeks. But I hope that this helps spur conversation in your own heart about whether you are being tolerant in the right ways or not. Are you accepting evil? Are you looking the other way when evil comes in? But at the same time, are you showing love to the person who is struggling with sin? To the person who, maybe is not part of God's body, but should be one day. And they don't need at this moment an incision. They need a suture. They need something to help cover up the wound, not to make it deeper. Think about that as we go forward in the coming weeks. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, everybody.